Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the book of Genesis and some of the foundational theological, philosophical, ontological, epistemological, all of that stuff we've already talked about, how it lays out those principles, sort of the bedrock that are going to be really important for talking about the conceptions of good and bad, right and wrong, and any sort of political formulations of those conceptions if we're looking at it from a political angle. So look at the readings that I've assigned for the book of Genesis, because I'll be talking about those in this next sequence of lectures. The first question I want to address is, well, how do we read the Bible? This, of course, is a very hot topic and one that that resonates even far beyond those who are looking to the Bible for specifically theological, religious reasons. And I think one of the best ways to address it is to draw on a quote. It's not my own, but I think it's very illustrative of the best approach to that question, how to read the Bible. And it's this. So let's say you're at LMU and you're coming out of the library, LMU's library, and somebody comes up to you, runs up to you and says, "Hey, is this the library?" And you say, yeah, library. It's right here. And the person says, "Oh, great, thanks. I was looking for it." So you say, "Yeah, no problem." You put your little buds back in. You guys all have the buds now. And the person says, "Whoa, wait. Oh, wait, just one more question. How do you read the library?" And then you say, "Well, what do you mean? How do you read the library? It's a library." He says, "Yeah, but I mean, do you read it literally? Like, do you read it scientifically? Like, how am I supposed to read what's in there?" So I think you probably got the idea here already. Again, this isn't my example, I'm borrowing it, but it's really illustrative, right? It's a silly question in the sense that if you're entering into a library, what you're going to find is all different kinds of genres, all different kinds of material that require us to use different interpretive lenses in order to get at the potential truth of the content. So, for example, if you go into a library and you go into the history section, well, it's very likely that you'll be using a literal or empirical lens for interpreting the historical text in terms of identifying the sequence of events that actually took place to the extent that we can recreate them, to the extent that we can know them, given that they happened in the past. Reading different people's accounts, reading transcripts. If you're looking at scientific literature, of course, you're going to be using an empirical framework. So that makes sense. Well, what about if you drift into the fiction section, to the novels? Well, how are you going to read those novels? Now, one thing to say is, you know what? Novels are, by definition, they're fiction. And so therefore, every time I read a novel, I say to myself as I'm going into it, I say, this novel can tell me nothing about reality, like nothing. I can't learn a thing from it because all it is it's made up, it's fictional, it's fantasy in a sense. Actually, fantasy is a different genre, right? Well, okay, you could say that, but is that a defensible thing to say? Think of your favorite song or your favorite movie or an image that has really sort of grabbed and held your attention. Why do you listen to it? Why do you watch it? Why do you read it? Does it tell you anything true? Does it reflect anything about reality to you that you take to be real in some sense? Well, if so, well, then you've already broken the interpretive boundary of literalism or empiricism in terms of reading something or watching something or listening to something. And so that just goes to show in a very basic sense, but still I think an accurate sense, is that just because you're using a different interpretive strategy when you are reading fiction doesn't mean that you're not capable of potentially getting something true or getting something real or getting something accurate out of that. Right? In fact, we could spend more time doing this just looking at different genres of music, in fact, but think of the genre of jazz and how you could potentially interpret jazz as communicating anything at all, when within jazz there's so much chaos, sort of an organized chaos within it. Well, how could we at all make sense of it or communicate it if we were just relying on empirical forms of knowing? So here's the point. When you're reading the Bible, you are entering into not just a book. The Bible literally means the books, plural. You're entering into a library of civilizations, a library of different authors, a library of different cultures, a library of different times, a library of different peoples, all put together into one book. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't identify some kind of coherence from the beginning to the end. When we're looking at the Old Testament in and of itself, and the New Testament in and of itself, and the relationship between them, it just goes to show that we're looking at a very complex collection of texts. Right? So the question becomes not how do we read this book called the Bible. I'll be using this version of it today. It's a big book, right? But how do we read the books that compose the Bible? And the answer is you use the same strategies you would use to read the whole library, the whole LMU library. You change your lenses depending upon the kind of genre of literature you're in. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use an empirical lens. It doesn't mean you can't use a historical lens. It means don't just use the empirical lens. Don't just use the historical lens. Don't just use the literal lens. That's a tool. Those are some great tools, but they're not the only tools. And I think the only evidence we need for that not being the only tool is life itself, our running tab with reality and all the different ways that we use to express to ourselves things that we take at least to be provisionally true. So let's crack open this debate of is the Bible meant to be read literally or not, and sort of push through it just for the moment. It's a much longer conversation, but at least just to get things going and say all of the above potentially, and then our job is to say how is this text in particular seeking to communicate to its audience what it wants to communicate, what tools is it using. So that gets at this question of the hermeneutics or interpretation of the Bible, and this will go for Genesis and it'll also go for other texts as well. Now a note of caution here, at least a note to be aware of, especially when we're in the New Testament texts. Christians take, for example, the resurrection of Jesus to have many different meanings, potentially meanings on top of each other, layered on top of each other. But one of those meanings for Christians, at least, is that there's a literal meaning embedded in that, meaning that Jesus Christ, and they believe there's good historical evidence to support this. Jesus Christ was a real person. He said real things. He performed real miracles, things that otherwise would be impossible just according to the laws of nature taken in and by themselves. He died a real death and then came back in a literal sense, meaning that the apostles didn't sort of have some kind of mystical experience where they thought that they saw him, or they felt they saw him, or felt his presence as it was sort of like a wind blowing through them. But also they saw him in the same way that if someone you love passed away and that person walked in to the room 3 days later and you ate with them and you saw them chew their food and swallow and you shook and you tried to wake yourself up, but then there's other people around you confirming you're seeing the same thing. That's what the New Testament, and especially the Gospels, is seeking to communicate in one level. Again, that's not to say there aren't other levels of meaning there. If it's a true event, then of course it's imbued with different forms of meaning. But that's one of them from a New Testament perspective. So we have to keep that in mind as well. We don't only read things through a literal lens, but at the same time, there'll be specific texts within the Bible in which that are crying out for one of those lenses being literal. So again, that gets at the hermeneutics or the interpretation. Hermeneutics is just a fancy word for saying what's our strategy for interpretation of a text, particularly a biblical text, and how do we justify that strategy for interpreting it. So I should have mentioned this when we first got started. We'll be looking at the book of Genesis. The dates of the book of Genesis are really, they're pretty contested. Some scholars push it all the way back to 950 BC. Some push it much more recent, but still a long time ago, to the 400s BC. It's very likely the case that even if this date is correct, that the authors were first writing Genesis in 950 BC or BCE, that the stories that comprise it, the oral tradition that comprise it, could be even much, much, much older than that. So we could easily be back 3,000 years in time at this point. So just know that this has been around for a long time. So we're not getting a recent text. We're not getting something that captures a sort of something within recent memory. It's a very old text, and that's important. It's important to keep in mind. that is sort of, it's pre-civilizational almost, in a sense, in some ways. It potentially has roots that are that deep. All right, so now what I want to get into is the main themes or idea. We're going to divide up this video into different parts, but what I'm going to do in this video is to lay out sort of the basic theological structure, the conception of God that Genesis has within it, and then the conception of God in relationship to the creation itself, and then within creation, to everything within creation, and ultimately to human beings in particular. So that's where we're headed for this video, and then we'll look how things begin to fall apart with the introduction of sin. So we'll get some foundational views here. Sorry, some foundational concepts. All right. To get started, let me just read the first part of Genesis. If you have your Bibles, I encourage you to open up. This is Genesis 1, the very beginning of Genesis. I'm going to read a few of the verses, well, several verses here to get us established in terms of what Genesis is after, and then we'll break it apart and look at what's going on here. So, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and that God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome, from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on the earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding every seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." It was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them up in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then, and this is the culmination, then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. And every beast of the earth and every bird of the air and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life. I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. And then the seventh day is the day of rest, which will be the Sabbath. So we'll stop there. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but what I want to identify, as I said before, is the most foundational ideas of what's going on. So I'm going to draw a diagram to try and capture how all these pieces fit together. So first of all, what the text makes clear is that there is a conception of God, of course, and God is particularly conceived not only as a being that exists sort of inertly, that's just kind of there, but God is a creator. That's really, really, really important. Because at the very beginning, what we're seeing is that there's going to be a fundamental difference between God and that which God creates. So in other words, God as creator creates creation. And in order to represent creation here, I'm just going to make a globe. Now this globe, it's not to scale. It's meant to represent the whole cosmos, including our little planet, in that impossibly large field of existence that constitutes our universe is our little speck, right? So this little speck here is meant to represent the entirety of the cosmos. So we'll put some land masses on it: Maine, Florida, Gulf of Mexico, Baja, nice big Canada, Hawaii. Okay, you get the idea. Anyway, so you may think to yourself, like, okay, I get it. There's a creator and there's creation. Wow, that's great insight. It actually is a great insight. Why? Because one of the greatest confusions that Genesis is already seeking to deal with, according to its own terms, is the idea that somehow God and creation are coexistent in the sense of being ontologically equal. Remember that word ontology? Ontology meaning existence, the nature of existence as in and of itself, right? That somehow God and creation are like these sort of two dual forces that need each other in order to exist, or that somehow there's a kind of creation here, and out of that creation comes God, and then God sort of creates that creation, so there's this sort of mutual birthing of existence. No, not from Genesis' perspective. Genesis is very clear. There is a God, and that God chooses to create something other than God, which means this, and this is a bedrock principle that is going to be foundational to everything else we talk about. If God is God and creator, and creation is something other than God, then that means this: nothing in creation, nothing in the universe is God. Nothing is God here in space and time. Now, one of the most fundamental features of the contemporary debate on atheism versus theism is this idea that somehow, according to atheistic perspectives, we can determine, not all atheists argue this, but some do, is that we can determine the existence of God by using empirical means, meaning that with the power of the scientific method and the power of the tools that we have in order to see out into the cosmos, we'll be able to see whether God is there or not. Others have called this, and I think it's a great way of describing it, the Sasquatch theory of God, meaning that some people say that there is a Sasquatch or Bigfoot or Yeti or whatever it is, and some people don't, or Loch Ness Monster, right? Some people say, I know there's a Loch Ness Monster. Other people say there's no such thing as a Loch Ness Monster. And so the role of the scientist is to come along and say, well, let's see, right? Let's develop the most advanced instrumentation in order to determine whether or not this creature actually exists. Well, some atheists use that framework for settling the question of the existence of something to settle the questions of the existence of God. Let's go out and look. Famously, the first cosmonaut, the Russian astronaut, this was during the when Russia was still communist, the first man into space, got up into the cosmos, got up into broke all the barriers of the atmosphere and got into space and said, I can see from here, this is a paraphrase, I can see from here and there is no God. Now, think of what's implicit in the assumption of somebody who says that, right? That somehow God is a being floating around in time and space, just like hovering like an asteroid out there, or some sort of giant cosmic cloud, that if we could just get high enough, if we could just get that satellite far enough out there, not satellite, the telescopes that they throw out there, like the Hubble, then we'll see him or not, and that will settle the question. Well, Genesis, old book, right, is certainly seeking to set out that option off to the side immediately and saying, look, if you're looking for God, the one place you don't look is in the universe, because God as creator cannot be reduced to any one particular thing in time and space. In fact, as we'll see later, that will be sort of the primordial error that human beings commit in one sense, and that will be called the sin of what? Of idolatry. But back up before we get there, it would be it's a cognitive error first and foremost to think that God could be reduced to something. Our youngest daughter loves watching this movie called Moana. It's a Disney movie, and it uses a familiar trope in order to tell its story. But basically, the story of Moana is about a young woman who saves the world by restoring a lost piece of like a life force. It's in the form of a stone or a shell or something like that, to an island that represents sort of the life force of all of the planet, sort of like a mother nature figure, but who takes the form of the island. And because that goddess, kind of like is represented like a goddess, is missing this one piece of her, the goddess has become angry and mad, but then is pacified once she has returned that missing piece. So on the one hand, it's just a story, and it's fine. It's nice singing, beautiful depictions of water. But on the other hand, a lot of people think that, well, that's what religion is, right? Religion, especially Christianity or biblical religion, they think what these religious people have in mind is a God who's kind of like an island, and that is kind of like needs to be appeased, like a god of sort of like of Greek mythology or Roman mythology. And so the way that they're perceiving God is like this. It's like it's like an island, but just a really big island that's animated and has arms. Or God's like an ocean, but just like a really, really deep ocean, just deeper than your typical ocean. Or God's like the stars, but just like way, way, way further than the stars that we can see. But you see, Genesis will have none of that, right? Like none of that from the very beginning. Because it's clear for the authors of this text, right, that God is not one of the things that God has created. So the last way that I'll seek to drive this home is that one of the popular motifs that some atheists use, I've even seen this on the back of cars, you know how some cars have the Christian fish, and then some cars have a fish that's eating the Christian fish that says Darwin, and then some cars have a fish that's eating the Darwin fish that says Christ or something like that. Well, I've also seen this in that ongoing bumper sticker battle. It's called the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Perhaps you've heard of it. And basically what the Flying Spaghetti Monster is it's depicted as a monster. So it's mean. It's got eyes, got a face. So think of it. It's recognizable as being a creature of some sort, but it's flying, so it's in the air, and of course it's made up of, well, it's made up of spaghetti. I don't know if the noodles or if there's also sauce. That's never been clarified, but it's made up of spaghetti. So what the purpose of this formulation or this meme is to make those people who use the word God sound ridiculous. So instead of saying, God created the universe, you could say the Flying Spaghetti Monster created the universe. Or if you, instead of saying I believe in God or God guides my life, you say I believe in the flying spaghetti monster. The flying spaghetti monster guides my life. Or you could say, I trust in the flying spaghetti monster instead of saying I trust in God. You see how this works, right? So it makes you sound ridiculous. And that's the goal of this, is to say, well, you know, if you just substitute different words for God, you'll get it, the substance of what you're saying, which is you're just appealing to this fictional, mythical figure, and you might as well just recognize that it's just as ridiculous as the flying spaghetti monster. You're just thinking of something and then giving it superpowers and divine attributes. Well, again, maybe some conceptions of gods are that way. There certainly are historically. Again, if you look at sort of Roman and Greek conceptions of the divinities, but not Genesis. Again, from the very first words of Genesis, it's making clear that neither anything in existence is God, nor is any collection of things in existence. So if you take spaghetti and eyes and gravity, and then the force that counteracts gravity, and movement, forward and backward movement, and 3D spatial movement, and put that all together, you're not going to get a God, right? You're just going to get pieces of creation that you've thrown into some sort of amalgamation. So again, I can't hammer this enough. Nothing here is God. That's going to have profound ethical consequences and political consequences as well. Fast forwarding a little bit, if nothing here is God, then you can't live as if anything here in space and time is God, and you certainly can't create a state or a government that is somehow taking the place of God in existence. All right, so you can already see how this is going to have massive implications. So, principle one, nothing here is God. In and out. Principle two, if God is the creator of all things, that means God is outside of space and time. However, insofar as God is the creator, God is also that power which keeps creation in existence, meaning God is not only creator, God is also sustainer. Why is that important? Well, that means that, sure, nothing here is God. Nothing at all is here is God. But everything here is related to God in the same way, at least in one particular way, and that's that everything is related to God as creator. And so while nothing here in and of itself is God, everything here that's originally created, we'll see how this gets broken down when we introduce the concept of evil. Everything that here that's created points back to the creator. So no, you're not going to find God here, but you can find evidence in the form of God's activity, God's existence, not direct evidence, but indirect evidence, but still real evidence from this perspective of God acting in and through the world by virtue of things being in existence. In fact, to fast forward, the name of God in the Old Testament, the name of God is going to be what? It's going to be Yahweh. Now, this is revealed to Moses in Exodus, but Yahweh literally means what? First of all, it's interesting. God gives himself, I'm going to use the biblical language, God gives himself a name. That's interesting, right? Because usually names are made to differentiate, to say there's different things, different individuals. So it's saying like, well, God is one thing and other things are another thing. But then you see what God's name is. It's absolute uniqueness. Uniqueness. What does God's name mean? Yahweh means I am that I am. Or put more basically, what's your name? My name is I exist. I'm isness. Isness is my name. So my very identity, what defines me as God within the biblical context, is that I exist and I alone exist. Only I have existence as such. That means that everything else that exists borrows in the existence of God and only exists because one, God exists, and two, God wills that it exists. So I want you to think of it this way. Next time you're on an airplane, I want you to ask yourself, how in the world is this lump of what, aluminum full of lots of people, you know, that's really heavy? Like, how is this getting to the sky? Why in the world is this possible? It should just be just stationary, right? It's so heavy. Well, you know, if you took freshman physics in high school, you're saying, well, I'll tell you, you've got this thing called the principle of lift, which is, you know, if you have a wing, and then if you create velocity over that wing of air, it creates a pressure differentiation, which is strong enough to counteract the force of gravity. And what do you get? You get something called lift. So as long as you're going fast enough and you've got the right sort of structure, it's going to generate an upward power. That's flight, right? That's the principle of flight. Easy peasy. We totally just explained flight. It was a really sophomore question for you to ask, how can you get an airplane off the ground? Okay, fair enough. But why does lift exist? Well, seriously, like, why does lift exist? Where is lift? It's embedded into the laws of nature. But where do those laws exist? What's keeping those laws? Because no, it's not a contradiction if they didn't exist. It would be a contradiction, for example, if God exists and then God didn't exist while God exists. Like, that's a contradiction. We can't even conceive of that. It's impossible. It's like conceiving a 0 and a 1 as the same thing at the same time. Or a squarish circle. Like, put that in your head right now. Square circle. It's not gonna happen, right? But you could imagine a world in which a creature or a machine with wings goes really, really, really fast and just stays on the ground. You haven't contradicted any idea. So it just happens to be the case that this thing called lift exists. Well, what keeps it in existence? What holds it together? Like, what makes it be consistently the case? For any of you who've ever studied David Hume, we're getting into some of those kinds of questions here. But even if you haven't, it doesn't matter. Ask yourself why things are the way they are and what keeps them the way that they are. Even at the atomic level, right? When you get into particle physics, you see that, you know, you have these at the atomic level. You have the nucleus of an atom, and then you have all these things called electrons going around it. Electrons are pretty crazy things for lots of different reasons. But one of the reasons they're so crazy is because, on the one hand, it appears to be utterly arbitrary how they move around. And we can't identify any kind of pattern to it. This is important for quantum physics. On the other hand, there does seem to be kind of a meta pattern above the chaos that keeps the electrons in orbit to the center. Well, imagine if whatever force or power or feature of the cosmos just gave out one day, like the machine broke down, or the maker of the machine was just like, tired. And all of a sudden, that electron force stopped holding them in orbit. Well, electrons would just go scattering all over the place. And it wouldn't be the case that sort of nothing would exist, but certainly reality would drastically change very, very quickly. So Genesis is getting at that idea too. Not only is God creating everything, but God is in everything as this principle of being. And it's only because of this principle of being that things stay in being. And if God so willed not to keep things in being, they wouldn't be in being. This is also going to be important later on when we get into, this is deeply biblical in the Old Testament, but it's also in the New Testament, this idea of logos, or God being present in the form of rationality. So one of the reasons that some of the earliest scientists were, they were Christians and scientists, and saw no conflict between the two. That's a fabricated division. There's never been one in terms of at least within most strands of the Christian tradition, the oldest strands of the Christian tradition that are now represented by forms of Catholicism and some other forms. The basic idea is this, is that the whole reason that we can understand reality in terms of our senses, because we can test it, we can create a hypothesis and then look at different variables, is because we are apprehending something that actually has a real pattern out there. If there was no real pattern, if everything truly were chaos, and there was no predictability whatsoever, there was no laws of nature, well, then science would be impossible. Knowledge, empirical knowledge itself would be impossible, because it would just be random data coming into our senses all the time. in an arbitrary way, and we wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of it, right? So science from within this perspective is also predicated upon the idea that there is a reason that runs through all things, that there is a coherence, that there is a kind of structure. Well, the way that Genesis is explaining that is that structure is the same power that creates. So, principle 2, God is in and through all things. Principle 3 is that everything is what? Everything is good. Now again, it's one of those things you could read and just be like, well, okay, that's what that book says. Everything is good, but it's actually really, really, really important, because here's the theological and even philosophical principle here. If God makes all things, and one of the constitutive attributes of God is that God is good, therefore, everything that God creates must be good as well. So there's a kind of philosophical argument coursing through this as well. You know, this is a narration. If it's true that God exists, and it's true that God creates the cosmos, and it's true that one of the necessary features of God is goodness, there's no form of absence, no lacking, which is one way we're going to be conceiving of evil as we move forward, then it's actually impossible, even from a conceptual perspective, for there to be evil in existence. Now, we're going to spend a significant amount of time trying to figure out how evil gets into the world from a biblical perspective, but we're not there yet. God recognizes every day that something is created. God says, what? It is good. It is good. So ultimately, by the end of the 7 days, everything is created. Everything that is and will be in existence is already there, at least in a form of potentiality. So that means that everything is good, without exception. That therefore means that whatever way we want to seek to understand the existence of evil in existence, we cannot, from the biblical perspective, from Genesis' perspective, attribute it to God. What this means in turn is that what Genesis is doing is wiping away from the very beginning any conception of reality in which you have sort of dual forces at an ontological level battling it out. You know, one very old but also a popular way that that's conceived is this symbol right here. Right? So the circle here represents all reality, and then we draw a line down it to divide the circle into two. And what do? On one side, we have all light, but in the heart of that light, there's some darkness. And on this side, we have all darkness, but at the heart of the darkness is some light. So this is what? This is the yin and the yang, right? This is a symbolic expression of a totally different metaphysics and a totally different conception of reality than what we see in Genesis. Because what the yin and the yang is suggesting is that, again, the circle being the totality of all things in existence, that there's two forces that exist within existence that are in a cosmic battle. They're fighting it out. And not only are they fighting it out, the forces of light versus the force of darkness, and then the goal is to kind of reach a balance, is that in that balance, we also have to recognize, according to this model, that there's evil in the goodness sort of by nature. That goodness has an evil side to it, and that evil has a good side to it. So it adds an additional layer of complexity to sort of the map of how all reality is put together. Well, that's the yin and the yang. The only point I want to make here is like that is 100% the opposite of what Genesis is trying to convey. Because for Genesis, it's only the fact that there's no evil and goodness. It's that there's no evil in and of itself at all. Not created, right? Because, again, the basic philosophical idea is that God would have to create something other than God's self, understood as the opposite of God. And if God is existence, then God would have to create non-existence in a sense. God would have to not be God. Well, that is conceptually impossible for God not to be God. God would have to uncreate God. Again, God can't be nothing. Thomas Aquinas makes this argument in a much more developed form. So the only possible way from this perspective of thinking about this is that God can only create that which is consistent with God's nature, which is existence out of God, but existence that mirrors God's goodness, because God cannot create no thing, or the sort of a hole in God's existence. I'll fast forward a little bit here again. From biblical perspective, we can, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that. All right, so here's the three principles. Everything, God is different from everything in existence, so nothing here is God. Principle number two, everything has a relationship with God. It draws back to God and finds its origin and source in God's ongoing will. And then principle three is everything is fundamentally good. Now, this is going to apply in particular to, we'll represent the creation of human beings here somewhere in middle America. All right, so we'll create the human species. Well, if everything's good, then that's going to mean that human beings are good as well. By definition, right? If everything's good and human beings are part of all that is, therefore human beings by definition also have to be good. And yet, we see that we are at the same time, from the biblical perspective, different from everything. We're not just that's where we're good. We also have, according to Genesis, that we are made in the image and likeness of God. Now, Genesis doesn't say that, again, anything else, is that anything else in existence is made in the image and likeness of God. Everything's good, but only human beings, and note this is the culmination of all creation for Genesis. So we're not the biggest thing. We're not perhaps the most enduring thing. When you think of the creation of the stars and like that's going to go beyond an individual human being. But we are sort of the culmination of God's creative activity in the world takes the form of a human being. And then that's marked by saying we're made in the image and likeness of God. So unpacking what image and likeness mean is it's a complex endeavor, but we can say a few basic things about it. They're really important for us as we move forward. First of all, think of an image, what it is to take an image. Think of a photograph or think of a copy, right? When you have a copy of something, what you have, especially if it's a very good copy, is you have the same thing. It looks to be the same, or it shares some of the similarity, so that you could look at the image and look at the original and say, oh, well, I see that this image is this is a copy of that. I can see the bridge between the two. But we have to qualify that right away, because we say, well, what's the bridge between a human being and between God if God is not a being in the world? Now, this gets more complex when we move into a Christian context and we see God understood incarnationally in the form of a human being, in the form of the Christ. But hold off on that for now. God here doesn't have a body. God is the creator outside space and time. So what would it mean? What are we looking at in the human that corresponds with God if God doesn't have a body? Well, one way to answer that question is to say, well, what the text is referring to with image is not a body or not even a physical similarity. It's not like, again, we have to wipe away all these ideas of sort of a God up on a cloud, a big bearded man sort of overseeing all creation and throwing lightning. Like, remember, we took that off the table for Genesis. At least in terms of the first creation story. So it's not a body. What would it be? It would be something like a soul. In other words, we share at an ontological level, meaning we're made up of something that also defines God's existence. So if God's not body, but God is real, God therefore must not be material, but immaterial. God must be what? Pure spirit. So something real, but not material. So one way to apply that to humans is to say that humans have a share of that. Not only are we matter, made up of the same stuff as everything else, like we're all made up of stardust. It's cool when you look at the elementary table in middle school physics, you see that for the first time, like everything is made up of these collection of things. Not the same collection necessarily, but here's the ingredients for everything in existence. We're made up of that in terms of our material reality, but we also have an immaterial reality, and we'll give it the name for now, we'll give it the name soul. So that's one way to conceive of what the text is trying to do, is that we have an eternality to us that the rest of creation doesn't. And here we're setting aside the question of angels. We have the breath of God in us, and that shows up in another formulation of Genesis creation story. Well, that's important in of itself, but it's also going to be important fast forwarding, especially since this is a class on ethics, on questions of good and bad, and right and wrong. Because if this is true, that human beings have a soul, for the sake of argument, let's just say that it is, for the sake of argument, well then what we've already established then is a grounds for human equality. Because no matter what physical differences may inhere among all human beings, and there's many of them, or in our own life, in terms of my own development, my cognitive development, my physical development, then goes up and then goes down, no matter what changes, even in terms of my capacities, intellect, self-awareness, all those things, there's an ontological stability to every individual, and that's that we all share in having a soul. And that separates us from everything else in existence, to say that human beings as a species are unique. And then within the human species, it establishes the grounds for saying that we are valuable, equally valuable, because we equally have a soul. We don't have the same soul. It's not like there's one soul that we all share. We have an individual soul, but that individual soul is of the same nature as any other soul in terms of how it's constituted. So that's a really important principle, because if we don't have that, there's a question of whether or not there really is such a thing as human equality, right? Because any other feature you look at human beings, is it really equal? Can you define it equally from an empirical perspective? So that's important. Well, what then could likeness potentially mean? Well, likeness, again, we're having to do some deep interpretive work here, but I think there's good justification for it, especially when you read Genesis in its entirety, in the whole Bible in its entirety. Is here, likeness is talking more about capacities. So while this is image is talking about that copy that we are, and it's important to note we are a copy, which means we're not God. We have a copy of Godness in us, but we're not God. Human beings will always confuse that moving forward in the text, but the text itself was clear on it. Likeness gets at this idea of these capacities that we have. So here we ask the question, well, what are two distinctly human capacities, or some distinctively human capacities? And let me offer you these. One would be something like reason or understanding, just in a very basic sense, without getting too specific about what they mean. I'll say that's one. What that gets at is that we have the capacity to know not only that we are, but who we are in terms of our relationship to the rest of the cosmos. So, for example, as a human being, I can ask the question and formulate the question and come at least to a tentative answer to the question, what am I? What am I? And I recognize both that I'm fundamentally different from everything else, and also fundamentally unified with everything else, at least in some way, being in the same realm of existence. From Genesis' perspective, reason is going to be important, because God is going to give a command that we're going to get into in the next video here, a command not to eat the fruit of a certain kind of tree. We're going to get into that, don't worry. Well, it wouldn't make sense to give a command. It's like, go outside and command a rock, like, not to roll over your foot. I mean, you'd look crazy, right? You can't command something to do something or not do something. One, if it doesn't intrinsically have the power to do it or not do it, but if it can't understand the content of what you're saying as a command, then it doesn't make too much sense. And here, reason it goes beyond just sort of reacting to potentially wards or punishments, right? You can train animals to do certain kinds of things based upon their establishing a connection, a habitual connection between, if I do this, I get something tasty in my mouth. If I don't get something tasty in my mouth. So I'm going to replicate this pattern. Here it's understanding who I am, what I am, and that I am the recipient of a command. So that's one feature that's at least distinctive to us. Another that's tied up but also different is some conception of freedom. And by freedom, again, I mean it just in the most basic sense. Again, we're in the world of Genesis here. The most basic sense of that not being compelled to act in a particular kind of way by an external power. And that would include even fear being an external power insofar as this is going to be the creation of the garden. There's nothing to fear here. So freedom here is sort of a pure freedom, a freedom to respond. And this is going to be important because it's not a freedom to create, it's a freedom to respond, which one formulation of that would be responsibility. Well, freedom also is embedded in this idea of human beings receiving a command. Because if God commands to creatures who are incapable of disobeying God or obeying God, then the command itself is moot. The command doesn't make sense as a command, right? So the command itself presupposes, one, that human beings can understand it, and two, that human beings can either act upon it or not, right? So in this whole cosmos of creation, God creates beings who have a share in God's likeness, image in the terms of having souls or something along those lines, and as a share in God's likeness in terms of having reason and understanding and freedom. And so that's what makes us unique within this tapestry. So here's the question that I want to leave you with, and then we'll call it a day, and I'll continue this in another video. Why in the world would God create a being that is capable of understanding and free? Because think about this. If God truly exists and God creates, and one of the beings that God creates truly is free, and free in the fullest sense, because free also capable of understanding, right? You're not free if you don't understand. Then God creates something that God deliberately chooses not to control. In other words, there's one being in creation that is God's activity and power and existence itself is coursing through all reality. Sort of, it creates something, and that being sort of pops up out of it and looks back at the creator. And by the creator's own design is not under the creator's control, precisely because that being has been created with freedom. So God, in a sense, speak metaphorically, ties God's own hands with respect to some of God's creation. Why? Why would an all-powerful being who's capable of doing whatever that being wants, consistent with that being's existence, create a being and then tie his own hands? Well, let me leave you with this idea. And there's a lot of potential interpretations here, lots of ways we could take this. This is enough to think about for a lifetime, but here's one. What's the condition for the possibility of love? Of loving somebody, right? Of really loving somebody. Think of somebody you really, really, really love, or somebody who really, really, really loves you. What's the condition for the possibility for that love to exist between those two people? Well, two conditions, maybe there's more, but two conditions are: one, you have to understand that the other person is other, right? You have to understand that there's this other person and that that person is different from you, and yet you understand that there is a kind of potential relationship between you, right? There has to be mutual understanding in order for there to be love. It's like people say they love their cell phones. Up till now, our cell phones are not self-aware. They're getting there. But you don't really love your cell phone because your cell phone is not a recipient. It's not another being that's capable of reciprocating that back to you. And we know that, right? So for true love, authentic love to exist, there must be two beings who understand themselves as beings potentially in relationship with each other. So reason and understanding is a necessary feature of love. Well, let's presuppose that. Can you force somebody to love you? Like really, really force them? And it still be genuinely called love? Like can you make somebody genuinely love you out of fear, or genuinely love you out of getting some sort of thing that they want out of you, and that actually be love? Or must love actually be free, freely given, and freely received in the mode of gift? In the mode of gift, meaning there's no contractual nature to it. if it in fact ultimately is an authentic expression of love that goes beyond all forms of dependency or manipulation or anything like that. Well, something like that is going on in the biblical context, right? This is a theological cosmic love story. God creates another being in the image of likeness of God, not out of necessity. God does not lack anything, but to give the gift of the possibility of love to another creature that is capable of receiving that gift and capable of fulfilling that gift in freedom, right? That appears to be what's going on here. Something along those lines. That God creates in order to be in relationship, of course, with all creation, but with human beings in particular. Again, not out of a lack, but out of a kind of, we see this in the theology of St. Augustine in particular, and it's in lots of Christian theology, sort of an overflow and an abundance of the divine love pours out into creation to create a being that then is given the opportunity to love God back, to love the Creator back, to be in right relationship with that Creator. Why? Because that would make that being truly happy in the fullest sense. But the kicker is that that being has to have real freedom to say yes to the Creator. To say, yes, I do love you as my source and my summit of life. And I choose to, I want to, and I act on that desire. I want to do it. But of course, the flip side of the freedom to say yes is what? No. So in order for the yes to exist as a free choice, the no must also exist. The possibility of the no, not the actuality of the no, but the possibility of the no. So what we're going to explore in the next lecture is what's embedded in this possibility of saying no to our Creator, to say no to God, to say no to the gift of life and the gift of love itself. There we're going to see that it's embedded in that no, not only the power to say no to God, but the power to turn all of this on its head. And it's that no that's then going to propel this story forward throughout the Old Testament, ultimately into the New Testament. So stay tuned. We're going to unpack that. But in the meantime, spend some time with this first part of Genesis. See what you think about these different principles. Get comfortable with them because we're going to be dealing with them for the whole rest of the semester. I'll see you in a little bit. Thanks.